All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this August 1st. I'm Titus. I'm the VP of Go-to-Market at Civic, and I'm the host of the Tokenized Identity podcast. This is a show where we discuss the latest and the greatest happening at the intersection of digital identity and blockchain. Now, if you haven't already, please hit that like button, use the subscribe button on the YouTube, or follow us on X, LinkedIn, or your favorite podcasting platform. Stay up to date with the latest episodes and updates. It helps us grow. Now, before we begin, I want to talk a little bit about Civic. We're a digital identity platform that provides builders with the tools to prevent bot attacks, Sybil attacks, and to enforce identity-related restrictions. And we do this through tokenizing things like CAPTCHA tests, uniqueness, identity verification, and you can even do compliance rules on-chain while preserving user privacy. Now, today, we're going to talk about some identity use cases and the required levels of verification to prevent bots, prevent Sybil rings, and KYC requirements for protocols, tokens, and contracts. We're talking about unmasking robots and Sybils with Jeremy Dillingham. He's a co-founder and chief product officer at Passport.xyz. And I'm going to let him introduce himself. Welcome, Jeremy. Thank you for bringing on our pod.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm part of Passport.xyz, which was formerly Gitcoin Passport. We're in the process over the last month of spinning out from Gitcoin. And what Passport.xyz, what we're trying to do is we're really focused on empowering digital decentralized identity. So we really help projects find and remove Sybils for various rewards or governance. And we do that by making it really easy. So it's super easy to integrate. It's like a few lines of code, and we make it as easy as possible on the end user to prove their own decentralized identity so that they can be part of those projects, governance, get rewards from airdrops, those kinds of things.
Awesome. Thank you. And for the audience out there, Gitcoin and now Passport.xyz, they're one of our biggest customers, and we're glad to have Jeremy here representing. So first question, there was a recent split between Gitcoin and Passport.xyz. Talk to us about that. Can you give us some details?
Yeah, for sure. So it's really a question of focus. So the Gitcoin DAO has been for years really focused on grants and ensuring that the allocation of public goods funding is done properly. So everything in their world is all about grants, and Passport was born within the DAO as a need to solve a problem for Gitcoin. So Gitcoin and allocation of public goods funding uses quadratic funding as the mechanism, which attempts to dampen total dollars and be more focused on people. And so as more and more people, bad actors, started to understand that problem, they started to try to game the system. So instead of donating $100 to one project with one account, they could split that $100 in 100 accounts and donate as if it was 100 people, and that would give that project a much higher allocation of the matching pool or the funding that was going to be distributed. And so Gitcoin Passport started to solve their own problem. And in the very early days, the largest partner for us was Gitcoin, and most of the users were coming in through the Gitcoin funding rounds, the grants rounds, we call GG Gitcoin grants rounds. But what happened over time is that we realized that the problem is a massive problem that's across the entire space, and Gitcoin started moving down the stack from our top partner to out of the top 5. But what we were doing is bringing lots of users to the DAO who are really focused on identity and Sybil, and that was really orthogonal to the whole focus of Gitcoin grants. And so what we decided to do is split the Passport project out. This isn't the first project that's spun out of Gitcoin DAO. There's already been a handful that have happened in the past. That will allow the DAO to focus on the grants. It'll allow the DAO to not have the Passport burn as part of the kind of DAO economics. So we would go off and do our own project. We'll still be highly involved in helping to continue to protect Gitcoin grants rounds as we have been in the past. But it enables us to have our own focus, get our own funding, and really take this problem that is large across the whole industry in a kind of much broader way. So we're really excited, and I think it's a really good sort of mutual parting that's going to help both sides focus and really get what we need to do done.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So let's dive into the topic of the day, right? Like bots, Sybil attacks. Like, what do you think builders need to keep in mind as they're planning good airdrops, good rewards distributions, like from an identity and distribution standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge question, so I'll keep a short answer. But if there's more questions, happy to talk about it more later. But really, um, the ultimate thing for people to ask themselves is how much do they care? So we've seen some projects start to get involved with us and then realize that they don't really care about Sybils. Like they're totally fine to just let Sybils farm or do what they want to do. And so like that's the kind of first levels to decide how much do you really want to try to solve this problem, and then if so, why are you trying to solve this problem? And then everything else kind of stems from that. And so when you're really thinking about like an airdrop as an example, what are you trying to achieve with that airdrop? So there's lots of projects that have done what we call linear airdrops, where it's completely based on the amount of money or TVL that you've put in. So if you put $1,000 into the project with one wallet, or you spread that amongst 1,000 wallets, you get the same airdrop either way. And so those are, pretty low on, Sybils being able to game that in a way that's negative for the project. And conversely, there's projects that really care about the people and want to make sure the allocations are going to the people. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. Um, and if you're doing that, then it really becomes important to determine steps that you're going to take to have those Sybils be, prevented in some fashion, whether that's, on the face of it, they're prevented because, it doesn't make sense for them to try to play that game. Like, if you look at the EtherFi airdrop 1 as an example, there were tons of people that were upset because the amount of allocation they ended up getting was quite low, and it didn't cover the gas of all the wallets that they spun up. And it's a hilarious thing to see people complain about, because it's like, hey, I tried to game you and it didn't work, and now I'm mad at you. But it happens. And so, really it's how much do you care? And then if you care, there's lots and lots and lots of ways that you can start to tackle that problem, of which Passport is one potential solution. But we've looked at the data in lots of different ways, and if you take some steps, you take some actions, it's almost always better than taking none. And we've seen that. So we've kind of seen the pendulum swing back and forth between we care much about Sybils, we don't care about Sybils, and it always ends up somewhere back in we do care about Sybils, because the projects that sort of take no action against them, it does not end up well for those projects long term, because it's just not real people.
Yeah, and I wish more people will talk about like what they went through as projects. And I feel like there's not a lot of talk about this unless like there's a really public outcry that the project got visibly Sybiled or visibly botted.
I mean, even then, they don't usually talk about it, right? And if you think about it from the project standpoint, what good comes of that, right? There's not a lot of people that want to talk about public failings in a way to help the ecosystem. If there's not some, some gain for them. And when you're talking about tokenomics, or you're talking about TGEs and airdrops, it's a really sensitive subject, for obvious reasons, right? There's large dollars involved, and there's also, in some jurisdictions, regulatory issues involved.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about specifics. Like you mentioned EtherFi just in your piece. I have a few notes here about like let's start with Eigenlayer. Like they try to point system to defend against Sybil. What are kind of some pros and cons about that? Is that like good approach versus no approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an approach that makes a lot of sense if you're really TVL driven, right? So if you're a project that cares about Sybils, and it's really easy to see a direct line between TVL and token, right? In the case of Eigenlayer, it makes total sense that the amount of LSTs, LRTs that are in Eigenlayer that are going to be used for restaking security, it's a pretty clear line between, they get the airdrop and they don't. What's really interesting with Eigenlayer is that the initial announcement of the airdrop that they were going to do was purely linear. So amount of dollars in, amount of airdrop that you got. And there was a huge outcry amongst small farmers, and they ended up going back through and effectively rewarding Sybils by taking the minimum from 10 eigen to 100 eigen. So most of the small wallets ended up getting 110 eigen instead of 10 eigen, right? So they like 10x'd that long tail of like really, really small TVL. And they did that to sort of dampen the outcry of farmers, possibly at the risk of including a lot more Sybils. And we'll have to see when tokens unlocked in the end of September what sort of the outcome of that is. But again, we talk about the pendulum. It's really interesting that they like started pure linear and didn't reward those very low like, small farmers that were putting small amounts in and then ended up shifting based on public outcry to do that. But I think it is an approach. It was the approach at the beginning of this year that almost all of the major DeFi projects were using. So, it's the way that Athena, EtherFi, Eigen all did it. And we're sort of seeing that meta narrative shift where people are like, this is great for the whales. This is great for people that have a lot of money and put a lot of money in these projects. It's really bad for people that are new to crypto or people that are trying to that have really small amounts that are trying to like sort of get involved and get started in communities. And in some cases, claiming the gas on Ethereum L1 may be the same price as the actual value of the tokens that you're getting in the airdrop. And so then it becomes this interesting sort of like, is this turning off a potentially activated base, or are we actually just punishing fake accounts that really weren't going to be part of this project long term?
Yeah, I mean, and they ended up modifying their mechanics on the go because of this public outcry. I want to talk about a second project that also had to modify their mechanics. LayerZero, they had an attempt to persuade Sybils to self-report. And I want to hear your thoughts about that, because that was definitely a novel approach, at least for me.
It's not actually the first project that's done that. I believe Hop a couple of years ago was the first to do self-reported Sybils, and Connext did it with the Next token last year, I believe, as well. So I think it's awesome. I don't think they were the first to do it, but I still think it's a really interesting mechanism, which is, hey, just tell us up front what all your Sybils are. We'll capture those and we'll store those, and we'll potentially provide them in the case of LayerZero back to the ecosystem. I should say at the outset, I loved what LayerZero did because they did it all in public. And I believe they've actually started to shift the narrative more towards we can do stuff to combat Sybils. And so we didn't get to work with the team on that, but I'm super excited about what they did and the impact on the community. So I'm pretty pro the overall attempts that they try to take. But that's an interesting one. Like, you self-report, we'll give you tokens anyway. Well, you won't get the max allocation of tokens, but you'll get some as a reward for telling us what all the wallets were that were part of the Sybil ring, and we'll use those to help find other potential Sybils that we think may not be reporting. And in doing so, we'll give you some rewards. We tried a similar thing where we ran a grants round. We only had $10,000 on the line, and we couldn't get any Sybils to come forward for that low amount of money. So this only works at real scale, where you've got potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line, and people are willing to take that risk of effectively doxing their Sybil ring to get rewards. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head of how many actually self-reported, but I think it was relatively low. But then they did lots of other great things, which is, they had the Sybil hunting community come out and find wallets. They were really public on what they were doing, and then they actually set the criteria of saying, hey, we're looking at maybe this set of criteria or this set of criteria, and the community was actually able to weigh in ahead of time on that. I think the only negative was then they required that donation at the very, very end that they weren't transparent about at the very beginning, and that turned some people off. But there's real pros and cons to what they did there as well, because they set the token basis for people in jurisdictions. Now, technically in the US, you couldn't claim that, but in the US, that actually was a pretty favorable tax implication, right? You're effectively buying the token for this price, therefore your value is low from a tax reporting purpose. But overall, I was like really excited to see from the sidelines how these guys approached the project. I think it was really a smart way to do it.
Yeah, I think it was. There were two camps watching this. One camp was like you, it's like super excited, like these guys are like out adapting in public to the Sybil ring and like to the issues that they popped up. And then there was another camp that was like, what's going on? Like, can we plan a little bit better for the next one or something like that?
Yeah, but what I liked about it is that even if there were things that weren't perfect, it was public and it was in the community, and they've published all the lists so that others can now build on top of that. One of the things that frustrates me with Sybil rings is that some of these rings are massive, as they pointed out, and people don't realize that. They're like, oh, who cares if they have 10 wallets? And we're like, no, they have 100,000 wallets, and they're claiming like a huge percentage of the airdrop. And if you're a real person, you don't want that. But but there's also no penalties. If you're a Sybil ring of 10,000 and you just don't get airdrop 1, you just move on to airdrop 2. What LayerZero did is put a stake in the ground and said, not only are you not getting our airdrop, but maybe you'll never get any future airdrop. And one of the concepts that we have internally is this concept of cost of forgery, which is how do we make it more expensive for a Sybil to Sybil, and make it cheaper and easier for a human to be human, right? Because if you're human doing these activities, there's no real cost to you other than it's just the exhaust of what you're already doing. And so how do we do that in ways that makes it expensive for Sybils, cheap for humans? And if you have these public Sybil rings that no longer get any future rewards, they have to go build new rings again, and that has an expense, right? And if you can continue to find them and do that, maybe you'll dissuade that next ring from building, because maybe there's a real expense of tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars that they're not going to get anything for. They'll stop doing it. And so that's something I'm pretty excited about long term.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I do want to get your take on also the zkSync airdrop, because you guys did a pretty good analysis on that and published it.
Yeah. Again, I think people are trying to do their best here, and I think zkSync was reacting to community feedback, in particular some community feedback that they had gotten the month prior when they had partnered with us around their community platform. And so they sort of took the opposite approach, which was interesting to see at the same time that LayerZero was doing their approach, which was less hands-on, less trying to prevent Sybils, right out of the gate. And I think that shows in some of the data that we saw kind of long term. But what we ended up seeing is that a week or two after the fact of the airdrop, users that had passports and had high passport scores, so scores greater than 20, ended up having more token allocations and actually held those zk tokens longer than they would have if they had low passport scores. So we saw, I think it was something like, let me go pull my data, but it was like, if you had a score above 20, which is the basic score in Passport for having humanity. So if you have a unique humanity score greater than 20, they ended up getting about twice the number of tokens as those that had scores lower than 20 or no score at all. And they ended up being about 2 times less likely to sell the token, at least in the time period that we saw. So they're holding the tokens longer. So what we're seeing with that is that, even if you're not using Passport, comparing people that have a Passport with a strong score ended up being a much better signal of real people and potentially people that are good for our project than those that didn't. And so that was exciting for us to see, like, sort of after the fact. And I wish we could have done more to help on the front end with that. But we're running some data analysis now where we're looking at the top people that got the zkSync allocations, and comparing those that user base to the user base that's in the top 1,000 for Scroll and Linea. And what we're actually seeing is a much higher scores for those on the Linea and the Scroll list right now. So we don't know that that's going to turn into airdrops for those folks, but based on their campaigns that they're running, the data that they've published, it looks like those are going to be stronger rewards to more likely to be humans than what we saw with the zkSync airdrop for the same sort of top tier users.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I think, like, in this world of like crypto and like people building in this space, there's a lot of options, as we talked about, like these 3 different airdrops. They all had different approaches to tackling the Sybils and the bots, and like, how can we help them choose better? Like the experts in the space, the projects, the tools that they have available, like how can we educate them? You talked about this level of like point system. Like, how can we make it more clear for them? Like, hey, this is the likely scenario that you're going to succeed because you have the data, we have some data as well. Like, how can we educate them better?
Yeah, I mean, it really starts with 2 things. Like I said earlier, what are you trying to achieve? And then based on what you're trying to achieve, the second thing is there's lots of stuff out there to help. And I feel like some projects, some people that are running these projects feel a little overwhelmed, at least in the conversations that I've had, and a lot of times don't realize the options that they have ahead of them. And so, for us, one of the things that we're trying to do is work with projects much earlier with just the data that we have. So even if you don't want to use Passport right out of the gate, how can we help based on all the data that we have with all the projects and all the information? Like, do they have civic biometric as an example. And we can use that data to help make selections around criteria so that, just as you get started, you can make choices that are much better. And so that's the kind of the two things. Like, what are you trying to achieve? And then realize that there's lots of options out there to help you. You're not kind of stuck just on your own. But for me, at TGE as an example, there's a lot of factors people are trying to balance, right? It's the happiness of the farmers, which may be happiness of the Sybils. It's the economics of the token. It's the longevity of the project. It's the overall community vibes. And so there's just lots of things there. And there's lots of levers that you can pull and tools and systems that you can use to make it better and try to maximize all those things where you can. I also would really caution, because we've seen this blowback before. Anytime we make changes to Passport, there's this huge outcry on Twitter, and a lot of it is bots and Sybils, automated to come to the defense of their rings, saying, this isn't okay. And we've seen this over and over, where there's airdrops that we worked with that I can't talk about because we're under NDA, but we looked at appeal processes where they've actually had systems where folks could give real data, and most of those appeals in those Twitter accounts that have been complaining they're just not real. They're just not real humans.
Yeah, I think the TLDR for me is do the research. Don't assume they won't be attacked. You will be attacked, especially if the reward is big enough. Like, to your point, 10K is not really super attractive for a Sybil ring, but if you're distributing millions of dollars, then you probably are on the list.
Yeah, what's surprising to me is that we've seen attacks that on a per wallet basis are relatively low dollar amounts. So it's not like, it has to be, I have to get $25,000 from zkSync to start to attack. We've seen attacks with, $50 or less per wallet. So as long as like you said, there's enough money in the pool, if I build enough wallets, people will try to game it and attack it. And you see this with gaming, right? Even if there's no real rewards, people attack games just because they want to win.
It's fun to be at the top. And it's I think in the crypto space, once we moved away from L1 restrictions, when you had gas fees that were prohibitive to recoup $30, whatever rewards, now you got on L2s, gas is basically free at this point for the most part. So it's pretty easy to collect a lot of wallets and a lot of money from the pool. Cool. And then, so kind of one more question here on this end from a builder perspective. Where do you think is best to focus the efforts? At protocol level, at dApp level, token level, contract level? Where should people kind of bake these rules in?
That's a tricky question, because it really depends on the project and what you're trying to do. So we've seen projects that bake it in at the protocol for the testnet as an example, and we've seen them also bake it in sort of at the not even at the application layer, but in the claims process, right? Which is almost a step removed from that. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. The thing I think people should start is with the data. There's lots of data, especially if the project has been running for some period of time. And you could start to use that data to help make those determinations of sort of which layer of the stack do you do and how you're going to do it. But we're working with projects, sort of across the board. So Hats has baked Passport into the protocol, and so people can, establish hats for different roles and access and things, based on the Hats protocol. And so that's super cool. And they do that purely on chain. And then we've seen others do it at the data layer. We've seen others do it, at the application layer, or at the claims process layer as well.
So then I think when it comes to these, obviously all of these strategies are ultimately hurdles for the user. How can we think about friction from that perspective versus outcome versus protection? That's always a trade-off. It's we want as many users as possible, but we also want to protect the protocol or the community.
Yeah, I think it depends on where is it the most dangerous for you as the project, right? And I think that this dichotomy between friction and user trade-off is a little bit of a false dichotomy. So people say, well, we can't have any friction at all, and we've seen that that's simply just not true. But they tend to react to that friction, and the user base tends to react to that friction very publicly. And in fact, that may not be real users, right? So that's kind of the challenge that we face. Um, I think that what we've been trying to do, and like in working with you, I know that when we first launched the Civic Stamp as an example, we spent several weeks like just trying to pull all the friction out of it that we could, so that we could make it as easy for end users as possible. So Passport as a whole, I know definitely in our partnership, we've worked on that to reduce the friction as much as possible. And so we've made quite an evolution in the last year, where it's much easier for real users to get passive passport scores than it was a year ago. But I think it depends on how much you really care, and it's not as much friction as you think to actually start to implement protections, right? Especially if you start with the data layer. And what I've seen most projects do though is that they kind of have it wide open at the testing layer. So when you've got test nets and things that aren't real, it's okay to have a massive amount of Sybils because they're basically doing load testing for you, and then tighten up as you get closer to mainnet and token launches, and telegraph that to the users. That's the part where they get really frustrated. If you've got a Wild West in the test net and then all of a sudden TGE, you're restricting Sybils, that's where people get upset. But if you start to like phase it out and let them know like there's not going to be benefits for you, you shouldn't continue this behavior, and start to put friction in place, I think it's actually really powerful. But I mean, you can look at the long-term outcome of a lot of these projects. The less friction that they did actually resulted in, project not having longevity because they weren't really users. So that's why I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy. And frankly, I'm a longtime gamer. I don't want to play a game that's been modded, right? If I feel like it's stacked against me, I'll move to a different game that I think I've got a chance to win, and I think is fair. So that fairness part, really comes into play when we're talking about friction.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you see like somebody with insane amount of points at the very top of the leaderboard, like that can't be a human being. Like how many hours can you put in this game?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it with a lot of these things, but some of them they've got a lot of funds, and so they put a lot of funds into this project.
Yeah. Cool. Recently, what was your best or in your worst identity verification experience when it comes to like getting into a project or into a community or a game?
Yeah, so my worst is probably we had a recent-ish experience where we were getting a grant from one of our partners, which was awesome. We love getting grants as a public goods project. And doing that, we had to KYC. And KYCing an entity means you have to KYC all the multi-sig holders and the entity, and it's like that in itself isn't an easy process and isn't fun. So we did all that, we got our grant, we were really excited, and then we found out that the KYC provider was breached. And so then there's this like a scramble of like, have all of our data just been exposed? Shit, this wasn't great. And so I would probably classify that as kind of my worst experience. My best identity experience is I was recently in Mexico, and I got off the plane and somebody told me that I looked like Keanu Reeves. So that was a bit of a false identity, but that was my best. But in reality, I refreshed my passport pretty recently, and it was super simple. Like going through processes of like getting a high score using things like civic biometric. It's not very hard for end users to do. So I was quite happy with the progress that we've made.
Very cool. Yeah, Keanu. Nice. I can see that.
It doesn't happen very often. It's a good mistaken identity when it does.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay, last question from me. So at Civic, we're talking about like permissions and permission smart contracts. For those just like tuning in, the way we're thinking about this is going beyond kind of the person issuing the smart contract who has control over it, but also who's able to interact with that smart contract, adding sort of identity thresholds to be able to interact with it. In a space that's like more kind of permissionless by ethos, what's your view on kind of introducing these kind of verifications as because more and more norm apparently?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to your question about like where in the stack, right? Contract is a part of the stack that you could have. I would say most people only wield permissionless when they're mad. Like if things are going well, people are fine if it's a more centralized, more permission type ecosystem. It's only when they're frustrated that they start to like sort of wield that ethos against you. It's kind of my my controversial take there. But I think it's interesting for me to have a plurality of different methods and different systems, right? This is part of the reason why we built Passport the way we did, but I love the experimentation in the space of like, we're going to try this thing in this way, and we're going to try this other thing in a different way. And then based on how those are playing out and what we see, we'll sort of start to learn which ones are used in which places. And so permission contracts, I think, completely makes sense for some projects and doesn't make sense for others, as an example, right? Having things purely on chain makes sense for some projects and it doesn't make sense for others. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how these things evolve, but I like the experimentation. And I like the ability that there's interesting things that might start to unlock, where if it requires, some ability to prove identity to interact with the smart contract, what new things does that start to open up, whether it's in the rewards, kind of systems or in the governance systems? I think it gets really interesting.
Well, yeah, and it allows us to put more stuff on chain that wasn't really available because it like kind of gets into a regulated space, like kind of securities or like real world asset, tokenized shared ownership, stuff like that, dividend yielding things that are connected to real worlds, like I don't know, oil fields or like solar panels or whatnot. So yeah, you can do a lot more things on chain if you're able to, for sure, restrict who can get access to that particular smart contract and not end up in, I don't know, jail because you're dealing with a sanctioned country.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the main risk there. Cool. So if anybody has any questions for Jeremy or for me, this is your chance. I did see Deborah on Twitter asking about like self-policing in this space. We're not going to probably see airdrop regulations anytime soon, nor do I want to. So how can we as a space self-regulate a bit better? I think, Jeremy, you started talking about like these like Sybil lists, like looking at the data, and that's definitely one way. Are there other ways we can do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see regulations in the space. I think all of us would, as long as they're smart regulations and don't just completely cripple the space. But yeah, I think as a community, if we can start to establish at least some norms, even if they're not fully like regulations, where we can start to punish the bad actors in a way that doesn't overly punish good actors that are trying and getting caught up in the net. But clearly these large silver rings shouldn't continue to get rewards, shouldn't be involved in governance. And so I think that's something that we'll start to kind of move forward. I doubt that we'll get to sort of like a norm around airdrops, just because there's so many different projects and everyone sort of reacts from one project to the other in how they're dealing with their own specific projects. That could be based on local regulations, but it can also be based on what we just saw, right? So if zkSync did a different, if they did their airdrop, 6 months from now versus 6 months earlier, would they have done things differently? Maybe, just because of the way that the ecosystem was at that time. So we're all sort of reacting to sort of what's in the moment, what's happening. The thing I would love to see more done is projects really pushing the boundaries, like trying new things that might be risky but are interesting. We tend to have a follow the herd mentality, right? Uniswap does an airdrop like this, and then everybody does the same airdrop for a while because it's like, it worked. And it's scary because there's no regulations. It's scary because we're not sure what would happen. And so I think as we start to sort of establish lots more of these systems, we'll have sort of these patterns to match. Like, do you look more like this project, and therefore this is kind of the norm of these projects with these airdrops? And then, with the self-policing, self-regulating part, how do we ensure that those bad actors are being penalized airdrop to airdrop to airdrop, as we've seen over time? I personally would love to see on the airdrop space people doing smaller airdrops more often. So instead of just one big airdrop for one season, do 4 seasons over the next 2 years, and use your own data and use data from other projects, right? Like, why are we not looking at everyone who's immediately dumping the token on day one for all these projects and saying, I'm just not going to airdrop to them because they're not good actors in the space. Or I'm gonna airdrop to my users, and those users that hold my token and interact with my community and actually are real users, then we'll get subsequent airdrops on top of that, because I've seen them behave good in my system, right? And so those are the kinds of things I'd love to see evolve over time and have more data points so that we can then determine, which ones will work best for everybody long term.
Yep. It always comes down to the definition of like, what is the user that you want? What is the community member that you want in this project that you're distributing tokens for?
Yeah. And I mean, there's a real like philosophical question where if a Sybil is acting exactly like a human and there's no detection, is that bad for the project? Right? Are they for all purposes actually humans? Most of what we see, they're not, and they're not acting like the rest of that cohort of real humans would act.
Yeah, makes sense. And on that note, I want to give a big thanks to Jeremy for joining us and for everyone tuning in. Jeremy, final thing you want the viewers to check out? Any announcements you want to plug before we sign off? Where can people find you, your team, Passport.xyz?
Yeah, so the application's at passport.gitcoin.co, and passport.xyz is our new site that we're transitioning to over the next months. I'm at jkd_eth. If you want to find me or chat more, happy to discuss.
Awesome. Thank you. And then once again, guys, if you haven't already, hit the like button, use the subscribe button on YouTube, follow us on X, LinkedIn, your favorite podcasting platform. Stay up to date with what we're doing here. It helps us grow the pod. And check us out on civic.com.